Mesopotamians loved their leisure, and play ran through the rhythm of their months. Out of every lunar month of 29 or 30 days, 6 were holidays, 3 were lunar festivals, and 3 were set aside for rest. Prime time for amusements both sacred and secular. Royal spectacle topped the bill. Assyrian kings staged lion, elephant, ostrich, and wild bull hunts that doubled as theology and politics. Success in the chase signaled divine favor and rightful rule, the triumph of order over chaos. Lions were sometimes imported and held in preserves. On hunt day, handlers loosed them from cages, while beaters and dogs drove them toward the king, who shot from a chariot, or, in set-piece heroics, grappled the mane and finished the kill by hand. The outing ended with libations over the carcasses and prayers crediting the victory to the royal patron goddess, before servants carted the bodies away. Persian monarchs later kept the tradition, and palace walls preserved it in endless carved scenes. Other competitive pastimes show up in texts and art. Terracotta plaques suggest boxing's popularity, and the Epic of Gilgamesh remembers a famous wrestling bout between the hero and Enkidu. Something like polo may have been played. Riders mounted not on horses, but on the shoulders of teammates. Gilgamesh is even accused of exhausting young men with such contests and abusing his power over young women. Archaeology has yielded real game boards. Most are stone or clay, and some from Esarhaddon's palace carry royal inscriptions. 2 classics mirror Egyptian sets. The race game of 20 squares, moved by dice throws, was so common that rough boards are scratched into bricks, and even into the pedestal of a bull colossus outside Sargon's Gate at Khorsabad. And the 58-hole game, a forerunner of cribbage. Lot boards tied to the zodiac survive with instructions on the reverse: how to draw 84 fields on the ground, the bird-named pieces, and play driven by astragals, the knucklebones of sheep or oxen, used as dice. That bird game still lives among Koshin's Jewish community in southern India. Dice themselves turn up everywhere and at every date: bone, clay, stone, even glass, marked 1 to 6, but without the modern convention that opposite faces sum to 7. Children's amusements spanned action and make-believe. Miniature weapons, slings, bows, throw sticks, echoed adult gear. Spinning tops, rattles, jump ropes, hoops, balls for juggling, puck and mallet sets, and buzzers made of pierced discs filled the active side. Domestic play featured doll furniture, dolls, animal miniatures, and model carts and wagons that copy full-size vehicles. Music saturated festival life from the early dynastic age onward. Courts and temples hired male and female singers for hymns, laments, and literary performances. Snake charmers, bear trainers, and jesters rounded out the bill. Excavations have produced strings, winds, and percussion. 8 lyres and 2 harps from Ur's royal cemetery, a clay whistle, cymbals, bells, and 3 drum types: hand drums or tambourines, hourglass drums for priests, and kettle drums beaten in temple courtyards during lunar eclipses. Trumpets signaled in war more than they made music. Theory wasn't absent. Second millennium tablets name 9 strings on the harp and describe a 7-note scale, and a complete hymn to the moon goddess Nikal from 13th century Ugarit preserves words and notation. Art shows soloists and ensembles, sometimes dancing as they play. Troops even march to musicians' accompaniment. Dancing itself appears mainly in cult contexts: whirling rites for Ishtar, feasting crowned elite entertainment. Reliefs picture kings and queens dining in garden pavilions, attended by servers and musicians, nobles in groups of 4 to a table, toasting with animal-headed Rita. When Ashurnasirpal II inaugurated his capital at Kala, he recorded a 10-day blowout with a staggering bill of fare. Thousands upon thousands of cattle, sheep, lambs, game, birds, fish, and jerboa, mountains of eggs, bread, beer, and wine in equal measure, crates of vegetables, oils, pickles, spices, nuts, fruits, honey, cheeses, and fragrances and perfumed oils for washing and anointing. He claims to have hosted nearly 70,000 invitees, locals, dignitaries from across the Near East, palace staff, and sent them home, clean, honored, healthy, and happy. Even allowing for royal exaggeration, the menu outline is clear. Abundant meats and fowl, breads, both beer and wine, brined and spiced sides heavy on seeds and onions, sweets and savories to finish, and scented luxuries to complete the experience. In Mesopotamia, literature was not just written to be read silently, but was often performed aloud, sometimes even sung. These compositions usually followed a clear poetic rhythm and structure, with verses arranged in stanzas of varying length. Kings frequently became the subjects of hymns and heroic tales, some of which even specified the musical instruments that were to accompany them. Such works were presented before the royal court, and at times the scribes may have been commissioned to compose them directly for the king. One ruler, Shulgi, even boasted that he personally wrote his own hymns. Some texts moved beyond entertainment into the realm of ritual. The Epic of Creation, for example, was recited during the Babylonian New Year festival, and its dramatic battle scene was acted out as part of the celebrations. Other works were clearly intended for cultic use, complete with instructions on how and when they should be recited. Yet some compositions also reveal a clear awareness of their audience. At the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh, listeners are urged to admire the city's monuments, its great temple and walls, and even a lapis lazuli tablet hidden in the foundation, an ancient form of time capsule preserving the memory of Gilgamesh's achievements. Dialogues such as the Babylonian Theodicy and the Dialogue of Pessimism read almost like scripts for performance. The first is a philosophical exchange between a sufferer and his friend, wrestling with questions that remain familiar today. Why the gods allow human suffering, and why prosperity so often falls to the corrupt rather than the virtuous. The sufferer laments that he sought out his gods faithfully, but was rewarded only with poverty, while fools and rogues thrived. His friend responds with the standard pious view that the will of the gods is too mysterious for humans to grasp. Yet the dialogue leaves the sense that divine justice is not easily reconciled with human experience. The Dialogue of Pessimism takes a lighter, satirical tone. In it, a master proposes a series of plans, and each time his servant enthusiastically agrees, praising the wisdom of the decision. But when the master changes his mind, the servant just as eagerly supports the opposite choice, producing new words of wisdom to justify it. The exchanges mock the instability of human decision-making until the servant finally offers his own dark conclusion, that the only true solution is death, since life cannot reach the heavens nor fully encompass the underworld. Other dialogues, featuring contests between symbolic characters such as summer and winter, or the plow and the pickaxe, present debates that end with reconciliation and friendship. These pieces may also have been performed, though it is uncertain whether they were limited to the royal court or shared more widely among the population. What is clear is that Mesopotamian literature was shaped not only by religious ritual, but also by an awareness of performance, audience, and the values of the society that listened to it. Over the last century and a half, Excavations in Mesopotamia have uncovered temples, statues, and a variety of religious artifacts, yet many sanctuaries were found stripped of their treasures, either stolen or deliberately removed for safekeeping. Much of what we know comes instead from written records, myths, ritual instructions, hymns, prayers, and even administrative texts that reflected daily religious thought. Personal names often carried religious meaning, such as "I was spared on account of Ishtar," or "Ashur knew my loyalty," showing how faith was woven into identity. The gods were believed to be vastly superior to humans, their wisdom and intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Myths helped people explain the origins of the universe and their own place within it. In the Babylonian epic of creation, the cosmos began with the mingling of Apsu, the fresh waters, and Tiamat, the salt sea, while Sumerian tradition credited Enlil with separating heaven and earth to prepare the world for mankind. Humanity itself was said to have been shaped from clay mixed with divine essence, sometimes blood, sometimes breath, so that people could take over the labor of the gods. But when humanity grew too numerous, the gods sent a great flood to restore balance. Religious texts often spoke of trespasses against the divine, listing sins both deliberate and accidental. A text known as Surpu recorded hundreds of possible offenses, ranging from family quarrels to mistreating animals. The belief was that disasters, famine, plague, earthquakes, or invasion were punishments for neglected rites or improper worship. Life after death offered little hope, as the underworld was imagined as a bleak place for all, regardless of merit. For this reason, much emphasis was placed on worship and maintaining good relations with one's personal god, who served as an intermediary with higher powers. This relationship was transactional, offerings in exchange for protection or blessings. If the god failed to deliver, the worshipper might threaten to abandon him for another, though a common proverb warned that you cannot make your god chase after you like a dog. Early religious thought was closely tied to natural forces. Storms, rivers, mountains, and fire were regarded as living powers. The Sumerians first organized their religion around such forces at places like Eridu, with water revered as a sacred life-giving presence. Over time, these powers were humanized into gods and arranged into divine families and professions, mirroring human society. By the 3rd millennium BC, with constant warfare, kingship became a permanent office, and rulers assumed a sacred role as mediators between gods and men. The epic tale emerged as a new literary form, casting the king as a heroic figure embodying the will of the community. Kings sought legitimacy by aligning their rule with divine will, carefully observing rituals, maintaining temples, and interpreting omens. Gods themselves were imagined as rulers of great cities and realms, responsible for their protection. Major deities, such as Enki, the god of fresh waters, were given specific duties by the higher gods, ensuring fertility of the land, abundance of crops, and prosperity for the people. As the Semitic peoples rose to power in the 2nd millennium BC, they inherited and adapted Sumerian traditions. The old pantheon remained, but the gods gradually lost their direct association with natural forces, becoming more abstract and distinctly male in character. Polytheism allowed for flexibility. New gods could be accepted alongside old ones, and divine rank often reflected shifting political realities. In this way, Mesopotamian religion evolved, blending Sumerian foundations with Semitic influences, yet always retaining its central concern with maintaining harmony between gods, rulers, and the community. In Mesopotamian belief, the gods eventually ceased to be seen as forces of nature and instead took on fully human qualities. Each city looked to its patron deity as a ruler and protector, responsible for political stability and defense against enemies. Agreements between kings and gods were even described in texts, such as the pact between Ningirsu and King Uru-Inimgina to safeguard widows and orphans. The divine world was imagined much like a human aristocracy. Gods were great landowners, powerful leaders, and masters of servants and craftsmen, while mankind existed to serve them. Myths, hymns, prayers, and inscriptions emphasized this relationship, portraying heaven as a mirror of earthly society. The gods were said to have families, courts, and attendants, their relationships often described in terms of kinship. The heavens themselves were imagined as layered realms of precious stone, and each deity was assigned a specific role depending on rank. Over time, as different peoples such as Akkadians, Amorites, and Sumerians mingled, their gods and traditions blended. Foreign deities were often absorbed into local pantheons, though there were limits. For example, Babylonians refused to adopt Asur, the god of their rivals. From the 2nd millennium BCE onward, divine status reflected political power. When Babylon rose to dominance, Marduk became supreme in its pantheon, just as Assur assumed primacy when Assyria expanded into empire. On a personal level, the idea of the personal god grew in importance. Individuals believed their prosperity and survival depended on the favor of their own protective deity, who interceded with greater gods. This bond was expressed as acquiring a god. Worshippers were expected to honor their personal deity with prayers, offerings, and rituals, much as one would show respect to a parent in return for success and protection. Yet even in this devotion lay a tension. Mesopotamian literature, such as the poem of the righteous sufferer and the Babylonian Theodicy, grappled with the troubling reality that the wicked often thrived while the just endured hardship. As politics grew harsher, myths reflected this same brutality. Tales described gods mutilating one another, while enemy deities were humiliated or condemned through ritual and propaganda. Assyrians even staged a symbolic trial of Marduk to undermine Babylon's New Year festival. In Assyria, Assur became not just a city god, but the embodiment of empire itself, with oaths sworn in his name. By the Neo-Assyrian era, temples were vast institutions reliant on royal funding, and the king himself acted as Assur's representative on earth. The line between palace and temple blurred, with the monarch serving both as ruler and high priest, personally bound by ritual duties and taboos. The divine hierarchy was formally recorded in canonical lists, some containing thousands of names. Many were of Sumerian origin, but political change brought new identities and attributes. Power tended to concentrate in the strongest figures, with major gods absorbing the roles of lesser ones. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, became both goddess of love and war, uniting many aspects of earlier deities. By the final centuries, around 30 major gods dominated worship, though countless minor and local deities persisted, including divine patrons of professions like brewing or brickmaking. At the top stood An, god of the sky, whose command was the foundation of heaven and earth. Enlil, the lord of wind, controlled both life-giving breezes and devastating storms, while his consort Ninlil embodied fertility. Ninkarsaga, the goddess of stony ground and animal births, ranked just below them, while Enki, Ea, god of fresh waters, represented wisdom, craftsmanship, and purification, often triumphing through cleverness rather than force. Myths, sometimes coarse and humorous, described his encounters with goddesses and the birth of new deities through his actions. The younger generation of gods reflected natural forces more familiar to daily life. Nana, the moon, who marked the passage of time; Ninurta, the thunderstorm and the plow, who ensured fertile soil; and many others tied to stars, rain, and growth. In this way, the pantheon embodied both cosmic powers and human concerns, linking heaven's hierarchy with the political and social order on Earth. Utu, called Shamash in Akkadian, literally the sun, was imagined as the universal judge, enforcing a single standard of justice across heaven and earth and standing watch at the world's borders. That ideal of one law under one arbiter helped justify the notion of a just war, a sanctioned struggle against wrongdoers. His sister Inanna gathered many female divine roles into one and was praised as Lady of Countless Offices. By the 2nd millennium BC, she was the most familiar deity in Babylonia, her name practically a shorthand for goddess. Myths linked her with the date storehouse, shepherds, and the life-bringing spring storms. She shone as both morning and evening star, signaling the day's beginning and end, and ruled love and sexuality, with special patronage of the harlot and the alehouse. The underworld itself had its own court and bureaucracy, Nergal as king and Ereshkigal as queen, with officials such as Namtar, the gatekeeper Neti, and even Utu and Gilgamesh serving as judges. Gods never withered with age, but they could die violently, overthrown in succession struggles, executed as rebels, or slain in battles with monsters. The cult centered on the god's image, believed to contain the deity's presence. When enemies carried off a statue, that god's protection was considered absent until the image returned. Workshops produced not only major figures, but also inexpensive clay versions and images of lesser gods. A family might even pass down its gods as inheritance. Sculptors typically fashioned deities in human form and treated them as living beings, eating, drinking, making love, sulking, weeping, sleeping. Their statues, usually carved from precious woods and adorned with metals, jewels, pectorals, and horned crowns, underwent consecration rites. Chief among these was the elaborate mouth-washing, performed first in the workshop and then again by the river, with the figure turned to west and east, and presented offerings while planets and constellations were invoked to vivify the wood and its decorations. A secret act of opening the eyes and mouth completed the animation. Installed on pedestals deep within the sanctuary, the gods resided with divine families and staffs, minor deities supervising human attendants like musicians, handmaidens, counselors, and scribes who screened petitions. Symbols and standards, horned crowns, golden garments, animal emblems, could substitute for statues in ritual if a main image was lost. Temples kept careful inventories of divine treasure. Offerings ranged from jewelry and clothing to vessels and seals, and trophies captured in war could be rededicated to the gods. Certain animals signaled particular deities: the dog for Gula, the lion snake-eagle for Marduk, the goatfish for Ea, and so on, associations that persisted for millennia. Because humans existed to serve the gods, the cult treated images as royal householder guests, washed, clothed, and fed. Temples employed priests, exorcists, singers, musicians, scribes, and administrators, and maintained strict purity. A late description from Uruk outlines 2 daily meals for the statues, morning at opening and night before closing, each with multiple courses. A table was set before the image, washing water presented, and then beverages, choice cuts, fruits, and other foods were brought. Curtains were drawn so the gods could eat in privacy, with music and incense accompanying the rite. Afterward, the food sustained temple personnel and sometimes the king. Architecturally, the temple was the god's estate and functioned like a palace. Reception suites, bedrooms, kitchens, courtyards, stables, and often a wharf for the divine boat to visit other shrines or rural retreats. Economically, temples were major enterprises, farming fields and orchards, managing herds, producing textiles, leatherwork, and woodwork, and trading abroad, requiring vast storage and workshops within or beyond the sacred precincts. They amassed capital and property, yet also displayed social responsibility, such as issuing interest-free barley loans during famine and taking in poor or illegitimate children. Temples served as legal stages as well, hosting oaths, boundary rulings, and share allocations, with gods or their emblems sometimes traveling to adjudicate on site. Religious space dominated the city. Towering mud brick complexes with decorated facades, columned fronts, and carefully planned sequences of courtyards leading to the cella, often preceded by an antecella. Ziggurats, stepped towers with broad stairways rising to a high shrine, became the most distinctive markers of sacred presence. Ur-Nammu's monumental building at Ur set the classic form and helped earn his deification after death. Sanctuaries were nominally public, but practical access was restricted. Votive statues of worshippers stood in continual prayer before the deity. Offerings ranged from routine daily provisions to massive festival sacrifices of animals, incense, oils, and butter. On rare occasions, human sacrifice occurred. The royal tombs of Ur preserve the most dramatic example where court members died, likely by poison, so the ruler was not interred alone. In Assyria, a different ritual addressed dire omens. A substitute king briefly reigned to absorb looming evils destined for the monarch. At the term's end, the substitute and his consort were put to death. A chronicle even records a moment when the substitute outlived the original king after an accident, effectively becoming the legitimate ruler. In all of this, the temple stood not only as the spiritual heart of a city, but as its economic engine, judicial forum, and emblem of collective identity. Its rituals binding community to deity, its wealth and works sustaining both God and society, and its towering ziggurat announcing the bond between earth and heaven. Hymns and prayers offer some of the clearest insights into Mesopotamian religious thought. Personal prayers generally followed a set form. They opened with praise of the god, moved into the main section where the worshipper voiced petitions or complaints, and ended with renewed gratitude and flattery. Their language was formulaic, often built on repeated epithets and traditional phrases, though personal prayers composed outside of temple liturgies tended to be more genuine and emotionally charged. People prayed not only for forgiveness or healing, but also to counteract bad omens, dispel the effects of nightmares, or bring magical power to rituals. When life went well, prosperity and health were credited to divine protection, while misfortune or sickness was seen as punishment for the loss of that protection. Obedience to the gods was reinforced through numerous taboos. Lists survive warning against actions such as invoking a god's name while wielding an axe, drinking from an unbaked clay cup, breaking reeds in the marsh, or polluting a waterway. Such seemingly minor offenses were thought to trigger divine punishment, often in the form of sudden accidents or illness. Prayers were usually tied directly to ritual acts, and instructions at the end of prayers described sacrifices and their timing in detail. Merchants returning safely from long journeys, for instance, would dedicate part of their cargo to the temple of Nana at Ur, sometimes even presenting symbolic gifts like a small silver boat. The temple staff was large and varied, including priests, priestesses, musicians, scribes, guards, and laborers. Female attendants generally served male gods, and male priests served goddesses, but most staff carried out ordinary duties such as cleaning and supervising temple property. Heads were shaved as a mark of priesthood, so even barbers formed part of temple personnel. Music was central to both state and religious rituals, and records mention hundreds of singers and instrumentalists at temples. Lamentation priests, who were literate and sometimes scribes, played an especially important role in arranging ritual songs. Musicians, both men and women, could be captured in campaigns and forced into temple service, and alongside them were entertainers like snake charmers and animal trainers, creating ritual spectacles. Temple staff were sustained by rations of food, drink, wool, and other goods drawn from temple revenues. Offices within the temple, called prebends, became hereditary and were even sold or rented, evolving into shares of temple income. By later times, prebends could be divided so finely that one family might be responsible for only a single day of service each year. Yet the income from such offices remained valuable enough that their holders insisted rituals be maintained. Women served in a variety of religious roles. High priestesses offered prayers on behalf of their families and sometimes took part in symbolic rites, like the sacred marriage. Communities of cloistered priestesses, such as those at Sippar, lived within walled compounds and often came from wealthy or royal families. Though celibacy was common, some priestesses could marry under conditions of abstinence. They managed property, engaged in business, and left inheritances to adopted children. Other women, especially those attached to Ishtar's temples, were involved in ritualized prostitution as part of fertility rites. Greek authors, particularly Herodotus, described practices in which women offered themselves once in their lives to strangers within the temple precincts, though details and accuracy remain debated. Not all female religious personnel were prostitutes. Some were dedicated to gods like Adad and expected to nurse or bear children. Orphans, children of the poor, and those offered during famine or debt could become temple slaves, often branded or marked, their status inherited by their descendants. Masters sometimes donated private slaves to temples, and conquered prisoners of war could also be dedicated. These groups, along with cloistered priestesses and ritual performers, ensured that temples had a constant workforce to support both the daily routines of the gods and the larger spectacles of Mesopotamian religious life. Temple slaves in Mesopotamia were marked with symbols of the gods they served, usually tattooed on the wrist or back of the hand. A star signified devotion to Ishtar, a spade to Marduk, and a stylus to Nabu. Slaves were also identified by their names alongside their fathers' names. Those who fled or refused to work were branded again, shackled, and sometimes confined in temple prisons. The demand for shackles was so high that temples frequently ordered them in bulk. Despite this strict control, some slaves attacked their overseers or resisted harsh treatment. They lived in quarters reserved for them, though a few owned or rented houses. Permanent slaves received rations of barley, dates, oil, and sometimes beer, salt, or meat. Clothing and footwear were also provided, though often in the form of wool that they had to weave into garments themselves. Some slaves lived more independently, paying the temple with either money or finished goods such as bricks and textiles. Religion tied the community together through recurring festivals, most notably the New Year. These events revolved around cult dramas, reenacting myths that reinforced cosmic and social order. A ritual text described households lighting fires, offering food, and reciting prescribed prayers. While the public's active role in ceremonies is uncertain, they were at least able to watch the processions as divine statues were carried through temple courtyards and city streets. Gods were believed to leave their sanctuaries during these events, visiting countryside shrines, meeting other deities, or settling disputes. Many regular festivals marked agricultural cycles, such as Thanksgiving for harvests or rituals at sheep shearing. Special offerings accompanied the first fruits and dairy products of the year, symbolizing exchange between northern farmers and southern herders. The phases of the moon shaped the calendar, with rituals performed when the moon disappeared at month's end. On this day of lying down, Nana was thought to descend to the underworld to render judgment before re-emerging as the new moon. Eclipses were seen as dangerous omens, requiring purification rites to protect the moon. The greatest celebration was the New Year festival in Babylon, lasting 11 days in the month of Nisan. The first days involved ablutions and prayers, but on the fourth evening the entire epic of creation was recited or acted out, affirming the world's stability through Marduk's victory over chaos. Ritual purification continued on the fifth day, and the god Nabu joined from Borsippa, along with the king. The king entered Marduk's sanctuary stripped of his insignia, endured ritual humiliation, and swore he had not sinned or neglected Babylon. His insignia were returned after he was slapped again, the tears in his eyes seen as a sign of divine favor. That evening, a white bull was sacrificed. Later, the king led Marduk's statue in a grand procession along the processional way and through the Ishtar Gate to the New Year's house outside the city. Another central rite was the sacred marriage, a fertility drama performed in cities like Uruk. Here, the king or priest-king took the role of the god Dumuzi, uniting sexually with a high priestess or queen representing Inanna. This union was believed to ensure fertility for crops, animals, and people. The myth of Inanna and Dumuzi formed the basis of the rite, and during the New Year festival offerings related to preparing the marriage bed were carefully recorded. Human life in Mesopotamia was seen as dependent on keeping the gods satisfied, yet the gods themselves relied on humans to perform the tasks they did not wish to do. The deities were portrayed as temperamental, ready to punish severely for even small disturbances, such as interrupting their rest. Still, myths often told of them stepping in to rescue humankind from destruction. People expected arbitrary judgment from the gods, much as they experienced from their rulers, and prayers often reveal frustration with divine unfairness. Death was explained as the work of demons or the arrival of an evil day, which could also signal the collapse of kingdoms. Magic and sorcery were deeply woven into daily life, without clear boundaries between religion, ritual, and superstition. Two broad types of magic were practiced: harmful black magic and protective white magic, meant to counteract evil influences from demons, hostile forces, or other humans. Fear of curses and enchantments was widespread, so counterspells and rituals were common. Texts such as Surpu and Maklu collected rituals and incantations. Surpu dealt with cleansing and removing sin, whether intentional or accidental, often by burning symbolic objects that carried the guilt of the sufferer. Maklu, by contrast, focused on burning images of witches to destroy their influence. Identifying the sorcerer was considered important, but most texts admit that the culprit was usually unknown. Accusations of witchcraft were rare and risky, since they were difficult to prove and could backfire on the accuser. In extreme cases, justice was sought through the river ordeal, where the accused was thrown into the water. Drowning proved guilt, survival meant innocence, and the accuser then suffered punishment instead. The interpretation of omens was another key way to understand divine will. People believed the gods revealed their intentions through signs in nature or unusual events. Omens could be requested, such as examining the liver of a sacrificed animal, or they could appear without warning, like eclipses, malformed births, or strange animal behavior. Each kind of omen applied to a different level of society. Something seen at home concerned the household, signs in the city affected the community, and celestial events involved the entire state. Specialists recorded rituals to counter negative signs, sometimes in extensive collections designed for many possible scenarios. Diviners were the trained experts who interpreted the gods' messages. They practiced extispacy and hepatoscopy, reading the entrails and especially the liver of sacrificed animals, which were thought to carry divine inscriptions. They also used alternative methods such as lecanomancy, watching the shapes oil made on water, or libanomancy, interpreting patterns in smoke. Birdwatchers reported omens based on flight and calls, while dream interpreters drew on collections such as the Assyrian Dream Book. Diviners often worked directly for kings or the state, advising on politics, war, or administration. Their authority was respected, and their craft was supported by handbooks cataloging every possible sign and its meaning. The central goal of all these practices, whether prayer, ritual, magic, or divination, was to maintain balance with the unpredictable powers of the gods. Through them, Mesopotamians sought certainty in an uncertain world, asking yes or no questions to the divine in order to guide decisions that affected both ordinary lives and the fate of empires. When diviners faced unclear readings, they relied on tallying favorable and unfavorable signs, with the majority determining the outcome. If the numbers were equal, the ritual was repeated until clarity was achieved. A negative sign was not immediately dangerous, provided the intended action was delayed or abandoned, and in such cases no further rituals were required. Omen manuals were carefully structured, listing the conditional observation first, followed by the predicted consequence. These collections expanded endlessly with variations, even covering unlikely scenarios, and many omens were linked back to past events when they were first observed. Over time, this accumulated knowledge became a kind of theoretical science with thousands of entries. A special branch of divination focused on the heavens. Astral magic aimed to use the power of the stars through prayers and rituals, both to foresee events and to ward off dangers. Specialists, diviners, and exorcists practiced this craft, compiling vast records of celestial omens. Simple prayers to stars or constellations often asked for favor without explaining the reason, sometimes listing divine names, natural forces, or rivers to strengthen the appeal. In one well-known prayer to the gods of the night, the diviner kept vigil on the temple roof, addressing the constellations while waiting for dawn, asking them to place a favorable sign in the lamb for the coming liver reading. Such prayers were often accompanied by the ritual gesture of raising the hand, directed towards the stars, constellations, or the gods of the night. By the first millennium BCE, stars were increasingly identified with deities. The supreme gods, Anu, Enlil, and Ea, were not linked to individual celestial bodies, but represented the sky as a whole. Other planetary bodies, such as the Sun, Moon, and Venus, became associated with specific divine functions. The sun god was linked to justice, the moon determined the calendar, and Venus symbolized love and power. The planets were given descriptive names reflecting their movements or appearance. Mercury was the leaping one, Saturn the steady one, and Mars the red enemy. Over time, observation of the heavens developed into a scholarly discipline. Astronomers recorded new moons, eclipses, and unusual events, and compiled them in omen collections like Wen Anu, Enlil, which consisted of 70 tablets of signs related to the king and the fate of the land. For Mesopotamians, there was no strict division between astronomy and astrology. The stars not only revealed divine will, but also acted as intermediaries between humans and gods. The stars also influenced medicine, magic, and daily activities. Certain days were deemed favorable or unfavorable, and calendars of auspicious days guided decisions about building, marriage, or rituals. Taboos marked evil days, often connected with lunar phases, during which fasting and abstinence were required. Herbs gathered under moonless skies were thought to possess special potency, and stars were invoked to strengthen medicines or charms. Mesopotamian approaches to health reflected the same blending of rational and magical thought. Two types of practitioners served the people: the physician, who treated illnesses directly, and the magical expert, who used spells and rituals to protect or cure. Alongside human healers, the presence of ghosts played a large role in the Mesopotamian view of sickness and misfortune. Ghosts were believed to be the spirits of the dead who lingered among the living. Some haunted because they had been denied proper burial or offerings. Others were sent as punishment by the gods. Ghosts could attack people physically, appear in dreams, or be used by sorcerers to harm enemies. Despite their menace, ghosts could be pacified through the correct rituals. Offerings of water, beer, ashes, or bread were thought to calm them, and magical practices involved tying protective knots, using amulets, or preparing ointments. Some rituals included creating figurines to act as substitutes for the ghost and then burying them. To consult or control a ghost, specialists prepared ointments made from unusual substances such as centipede dust, frog intestines, lion fat, or goose marrow, which allowed them to see or speak with the spirit. If these remedies failed, another ritual of undoing was performed, often carried out by professional ghost raisers. In this way, the Mesopotamian world was one where stars, spirits, and omens shaped everyday existence. The heavens dictated time and fate, rituals promised protection, and the unseen presence of ghosts reminded people of the thin boundary between the living and the dead. Through these practices, they sought to understand and negotiate a universe that was at once ordered and deeply unpredictable. In Mesopotamian thought, demons were formless agents of harm, neither male nor female, drifting presences that ignored prayer and offerings and prowled streets and roads sowing trouble. They often came in packs of 7, a number invoked in stock charms aimed at driving them off. A few figures were vividly drawn. Lamashtu, said to be the daughter of Anu, targeted pregnant women, new mothers, and infants. Ritual handbooks paired incantations with actions that humiliated or expelled her, smashing or burying her effigy, sending it downriver, or banishing it to the wasteland. Pazuzu was the counterforce commonly summoned to blunt her attacks. Another feared presence was the Maid of the Storm, prototype of later Lilith traditions. A spurned bride whose thwarted sexuality became vengeance, impotence for men, barrenness for women. Those who died unmarried were thought to become lilu, slipping through windows to seize stand-in spouses, sometimes dragging victims to an early death to swell their own ranks. Demons had no cults and took no offerings. Many bore names like evil fate or disorder, and some were imagined as offspring of high gods, Anu and Enlil, who were not always kindly toward humans. Yet not every spirit was hostile. Colossal human-headed bulls and lions guarding Assyrian gates embodied protective power according to their form, as kings boasted, carved from rare stone to repel malign forces. When ominous signs appeared, specialists turned to Namburbu, undoing rites that shifted the threat onto a disposable object. A small male or female figurine was fashioned at First Crescent and hurled into the river with a plea that the evil be released, then followed by offerings and fumigations to placate the sending deity. Some prayers speak directly to a god, Shamash, judge above and below, begging release even from something as mundane yet menacing as a dog's defilement. Temple life had its own indispensable ceremonies, from choosing a site through consecration. Builders threaded the work with rites, and the cult images underwent mouth-washing /opening to reanimate them after carving, repair, or profanation. Certain healings were timed to the sky. At dawn on the full moon setting, when sun and moon share the horizon, an exorcist might stage a ghost-banishing service with cuts of bloodletting, offerings of milk to Sin at sunset, and beer to Shamash at sunrise, and set formulas recited in 7s and 3s before the patient changed into purified garments. Everyday needs also drew on ritual technology. Love magic manuals teach how to heat desire, from petitions to Ishtar of the stars at a reed altar to the burning of paired figurines, or women's charms to coax an angry husband back. Potency spells mix frank erotic imagery with animal potency symbolism. Objects touched to the beloved, oaths to make arousal flow like a river, and wishes that embrace wind, orchards, clouds, and rain. For homes and palaces, prophylaxis was architectural. Apotropaic figures buried by thresholds and drains, dogs named Don't Stop to Think Bite or Loud of Bark, and other guardian types, blocking the inlets demons preferred. Handbooks cataloged the virtues of stones and materials, magnetite praised for its capturing pull, hematite dubbed the stone of truth, fit only for the devout. Short lists pair minerals, metals, shells, and herbs, sometimes sexed as male or female, sometimes chosen for natural marks. Amulets threaded these beads on colored wool and were tied at the neck, wrists, ankles, or laid over chest and belly. A tiny tablet even prescribes 11 stones for blurred vision to string on red wool while speaking a charm. Whether hung on bodies, buried in walls, or set beneath doorways, such objects were activated by starlight or recitation, folding the cosmic and the domestic into a single mesh of protection. In Mesopotamia, prophecy was thought to be a temporary calling. Men and women, often described as ecstatics, were seized by a god to deliver a message for a moment, a crisis, or a season. The initiative usually came from the deity, though people could also try to prompt it. What they received, visions, dreams, auditions, or even signs gleaned through divinatory techniques, was then recited or written down, frequently in heightened, almost poetic language. The practice was widespread across the Near East, but only a sliver of texts survives. In Assyria, after the 8th century BC, these sayings were compiled into tablet series, giving prophecy a formal cultic footing. Akkadian prophecies often read like predictions, but refer to events that had already taken place, their phrasing modeled on omen handbooks. The richest trove of such material comes from Mari. Oracular messages could resemble prophecy, yet be channeled through priests. One striking Assyrian report has Ishtar of Arbela appearing armed for battle, speaking tenderly yet commandingly to Assurbanipal, promising to fight on his behalf against Teumen of Elam. Subsequent events, including Teumen's defeat and beheading, allowed the court to credit the goddess with both strategy and ruthlessness. Not every ruler accepted what the specialists said. A letter to the superstitious Esarhaddon chided him for ignoring an eclipse reading, only for a high official to die soon after, exactly as the text had warned. Because diviners could massage unfavorable signs into hopeful ones, Sennacherib sometimes split them into independent groups to test their honesty, a royal version of a control experiment. Kingship itself was framed as a divine institution. A proverb captured the hierarchy. Humans are the shadows of gods, slaves the shadows of men. But a king is a god's mirror, and political events were seen as reflections of heavenly decisions. Titles varied with city and era. Accountants of temple estates could become rulers. High priestly figures and city governors could rise. The great man, Lugal, eventually became the standard king. Unlike Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian rulers were usually mortal in status, though a few claimed divinity and were served by cults that mimicked those of traditional gods. Legitimation came through divine choice, gods taking the king's hand, but also through ancestry, even if succession did not always follow primogeniture. Omen series teemed with signs about the monarch's safety. To blunt bad portents, Assyrian kings endured fasts, ritual seclusion, special clothing, and other taboos until the danger window closed. Popular acceptance mattered too. Usurpers like Uru-Inimgina advertised social reforms and protections for widows and orphans to shore up consent. Installation rites at centers like Ur, Nippur, and Uruk revolved around crown, throne, and scepter. Images repeated in hymns that wished the ruler justice-wielding power, fecund reigns, and a populace that multiplied under firm but righteous rule. Royal households were both family and state theater. Daughters could be placed in prestigious priesthoods as acts of piety and policy. Inside the palace, the women's quarters were tightly controlled. Courtiers risked mutilation or death for breaches of conduct. Even catching an accidental glimpse of an undressed palace woman could bring a beating. The harem was guarded by eunuchs. Discipline among the women could be brutal, and edicts describe punishments meted out within. Now and then, a queen or queen mother wielded real power. Sennacherib's Syrian-born consort, Nakia Zakutu, is a case in point. Her death was solemn enough to be noted in the Babylonian Chronicle, and during the crisis following Sennacherib's assassination, she effectively held the reins until Esarhaddon could be enthroned. Her influence endured into Assurbanipal's reign. Administration expanded with territory. Palace bureaucracy likely grew from temple models, with detailed record-keeping of people and commodities. As empires absorbed cities, former polities became provinces governed by appointees. Hammurabi, for example, preserved local structures while asserting central control. The palace was a small city. Residence, ministries, workshops, storehouses, and treasury, with a throne room and audience halls for ceremony. Sub-courts sprang up around the crown prince or queen mother. A designated house of succession could house the heir. Governors kept residences in the capital. Caravans and shipments fed the court and its animals. Kings micromanaged. Letters show Hammurabi tracking taxes, canals, walls, labor, and officials defended themselves against charges of delay or negligence. Above all, The ruler's job description fused piety and policy. He was to secure justice, protect the weak, and guarantee prosperity, the visible signs of divine favor. He endowed temples, commissioned statues, provided revenues, staffed festivals, and took part in great seasonal rites. When he could not attend, a royal stand-in did. Building and rebuilding sanctuaries was a sacred duty. Iconography shows kings carrying baskets of clay or laying the first brick. In emergencies, eclipses, ominous births, bad celestial signs, he submitted to the same ritual regimen that governed his subjects, only more so because the welfare of the realm was thought to ride on his alignment with heaven. Mesopotamian kings were expected to dispense justice in the god's stead and served as the ultimate court of appeal, though they often sent disputes back to local authorities. Court procedure was methodical. Each side gave oral statements, witnesses were examined, written records were produced. Even very old tablets could be opened from their clay envelopes and read. And if facts were still murky, judges wrote to officials to summon more testimony or investigate on site. Punishments were meant to match the offense. Day-to-day judging was handled by town elders, mayors, and benches of judges who sat at the gate or in temple courtyards, with verdicts announced by a herald. Difficult accusations, such as perjury, sorcery, adultery, or homicide, could be settled by the river ordeal, where drowning signified guilt and survival innocence. Although attorneys are not attested, a professional class of judges appears by the early 2nd millennium BC, some styled judges of the king, and they were bound by strict standards. Hammurabi threatens any judge who reverses himself after sealing a decision with a 12-fold fine and removal from office. Courts had supporting officials. A soldier functioned like a sheriff to enforce orders and recover property. A barber marked slave status and later destroyed voided tablets, and a herald broadcast official notices, from lost seals to slave runaways to conscriptions and sales. The king could hear cases himself, require oaths, issue rulings with community-wide consequences, and his edicts and letters show hands-on oversight. Murder cases were traditionally his prerogative. Royal decrees might impose capital punishment for fraud or abuse of office, and later rulers granted remissions of labor and debt to cities. Transactions could be concluded orally or in writing, and often used stock formulas and symbolic acts to signal divorce, disinheritance, servitude, or guarantee. Contracts, covering sales, loans, partnerships, deposits, employment, marriage, adoption, and inheritance, followed recognizable patterns, listed witnesses, and seals, and were sometimes enclosed in sealed clay cases to secure the text. Curses in later Babylonian documents warned against breaking terms. On coming to power, kings issued reform edicts to relieve social pressure. Over time, some also compiled law collections framed by royal prologues and epilogues. These codes, written in if-then case style rather than arranged by subject, drew on custom and earlier decisions and could be cited as models. The fullest is Hammurabi's, with 282 cases beneath a scene of the king receiving the rod and ring from Shamash. Its penalties are notably severe, prescribing death, mutilation, and beatings more often than earlier collections. The epilogue presents the stele as a beacon for the wronged to read and find peace, and as guidance for future rulers. Yet, surviving court records rarely quote the code directly, and everyday practice sometimes diverged from its provisions. In Assyria, merchant statutes are referenced in Old Assyrian texts. The Middle Assyrian laws, preserved in fragments, treat women, property, slaves, livestock, and goods reflect especially harsh punishments and low female status, and make frequent use of the river ordeal. After the 2nd millennium BC, Assyrian legal codification does not continue, but royal justice, local benches, rigorous procedure, and the king's role as guarantor of order remain the backbone of the system. Conflicts in Mesopotamia often grew out of disputes over wealth, fertile land, irrigation rights, and access to the Tigris and Euphrates, as well as the desire to obtain timber, stone, and metals. Early city walls, perhaps first intended to keep out wild animals and thieves or to control flooding, soon became symbols of political power. These fortifications, sometimes richly decorated, proclaimed a ruler's strength as much as they offered protection. Warfare itself was explained as the will of the gods. Kings justified their campaigns by presenting themselves as divine agents. Sargon II, for example, claimed that his war against Urartu was punishment ordained by Assur for the sins of its ruler. Such declarations were recited publicly, blending religion with political propaganda. Before and during campaigns, diviners consulted omens and animal entrails to ask specific questions about enemies and battles, and royal inscriptions praised Ishtar as a goddess who marched beside the king. Ancient powers varied in their approach to the rules of war. Egyptians avoided surprise attacks, while the Hittites embraced them. The Assyrians, in contrast, perfected the use of terror as a weapon. Their inscriptions and palace reliefs describe scenes of blinding, mutilation, impalement, and mass executions, all displayed deliberately to break enemy morale. Conquered towns could expect looting, burning, enslavement, and horrific violence. Prisoners were often flayed alive or had their heads displayed as trophies. The Assyrian kings, such as Ashurnasirpal II, boasted of massacres and acts of cruelty that left survivors too frightened to resist. Siege warfare and pitched battles were used, but psychological pressure, threats, propaganda, and calculated brutality was often preferred to save time and resources. The spoils of conquest were divided, with soldiers taking part in plunder while the king reserved luxury goods for palaces and temples. Maintaining control of conquered peoples was another challenge. The Assyrians developed deportation as policy. Whole populations were uprooted and resettled elsewhere. This both punished rebellion and provided labor for agriculture and monumental building projects, while weakening resistance to Assyrian authority. The practice, begun in earlier centuries, became systematic from the 9th century BC onward, with hundreds of thousands displaced. Deportees contributed to the empire's cosmopolitan character, supplying workers, farmers, and even soldiers. Persistent rebels faced gruesome punishments, such as public flaying or execution, with their kings' heads displayed in Assyrian capitals. Military organization evolved over time. Early texts from Sumer describe constant wars, with conscription and record-keeping of men, weapons, and chariots. Sargon of Akkad boasted of thousands of soldiers who dined with him daily, marking the first known standing army. Later kings, such as Shulgi, developed specialized military units. During the Old Babylonian period, the Ilkham system tied land ownership to military service. A man who failed to answer the call to arms could be executed, and the Code of Hammurabi prohibited hiring substitutes, although in practice some contracts allowed it. Soldiers' land grants could be inherited but not sold, ensuring the link between property and service. Documents distinguish between regular troops, reserves, nomadic auxiliaries, and foreign specialists. For example, Kassaitis were valued horsemen, and Euphrates tribes were conscripted for patrol duties. Assyrian military forces grew enormously with empire. By the Iron Age, conquered peoples were incorporated into the army and eventually gained rights equal to native Assyrians. Records claim steadily rising troop numbers. Shalmaneser III spoke of more than 40,000 men, Tiglath-Pileser III of nearly 73,000, and Sennacherib of over 200,000. Whether these figures were inflated or not, they show how rulers projected power. By combining organized armies, harsh discipline, calculated terror, and the claim of divine mandate, Mesopotamian states, above all the Assyrians, transformed warfare into an instrument of both conquest and control. Sennacherib divided the royal army into separate contingents, sometimes placing them nominally under the authority of the queen or crown prince. Although queens were not usually active in military affairs, one inscription credits Samuramat, wife of Shamshi-Adad V and mother of Adad-Nirari III, with playing a decisive role in a campaign that fixed boundaries among 3 regions. Once the Assyrians subdued an area, administration followed directly from military control. The king was both political leader and commander-in-chief, supported by a small circle of senior officers, a field marshal who led the army in the king's absence, a vice-chancellor who advised on state affairs, and a major domo who held unique access to the ruler. Authority was flexible, and the king could bypass ranks to give direct orders. Official appointments, however, often reflected patronage and personal gain rather than integrity. Governors treated their provinces as private domains, extracting wealth through bribes, taxes, and favors. The structure of the army itself was diverse. Chariot units contained a driver, a shield-bearer, and a third man, often forming the king's personal guard. Infantry, cavalry, engineers, and supply units made up the rest. Soldiers could serve as scouts, messengers, laborers clearing roads, or shock troops breaching city defenses. With the growing size of the army, new facilities appeared, such as the Review Palace, described by Esarhaddon, built to manage troops, weapons, horses, and captured spoils. Equipment and weapons varied widely. Foot soldiers carried axes, spears, bows, and maces. Later they used swords and iron weapons. Defensive gear included helmets, small shields, and scale armor for both men and horses. Chariots became central in warfare after their introduction by the Hurrians and Hittites, ranging from heavy 4-wheeled vehicles to lighter 2-wheeled models for speed and maneuver. Charioteers wore elaborate armor made from hundreds of overlapping copper or bronze scales, crafted in palace workshops. Military campaigns could involve long marches, pitched battles, sieges, and raids. Planning was meticulous. Shamshi-Adad I's correspondence with his sons shows how routes, supplies, and intelligence gathering were carefully coordinated. Couriers used a system of posting stations and fresh mule teams, traveling up to 30 kilometers a day, while signal fires relayed urgent news across vast territories. Garrisons were stationed in conquered towns, and troops were drawn from both urban and nomadic populations. Siege tactics became increasingly sophisticated. Engineers redirected rivers to weaken city walls, built ramps and scaffolds, or employed battering rams. Mari texts mention prefabricated siege towers floated downstream to battle sites. Soldiers sometimes crossed rivers on inflated skins, while bridges and temporary roads facilitated the transport of supplies and siege engines. The Assyrians also employed naval forces when necessary. Sennacherib was the first Mesopotamian ruler known to cross the Persian Gulf with a fleet of warships built by Greek craftsmen. Campaign accounts describe widespread destruction, orchards cut down, irrigation systems ruined, and city walls leveled. Yet complete devastation was often avoided in favor of submission. Psychological pressure, propaganda, and demonstrations of force often preceded open battle. Detachments marched through territories collecting tribute and reorganizing administration, only resorting to full-scale assault when resistance proved unavoidable. Surprise attacks, night operations, deception, and the use of spies all formed part of their strategy, ensuring efficiency and minimizing their own losses while projecting an image of invincibility. When battles ended, victors stripped cities, homes, and people of anything valuable. In local conflicts within Sumer and Akkad, sanctuaries were usually spared because the gods were shared. That restraint vanished when enemies were involved. Elamites were remembered for violating Ur's inner shrines and wrecking their adornments, and the Hittites famously hauled off Marduk's statue after taking Babylon. Spoils followed recognized customs. The king kept the richest share: gold, silver, ivory, objets de luxe to embellish palaces and temples, while commanders received portions and often landed estates as rewards. From the 8th to the 7th centuries BC, we even see paired recorders tallying loot side by side, one inscribing in Akkadian on clay, the other in Aramaic on parchment or leather. Soldiers treated plunder as part of their compensation. Kings also dedicated tokens from their booty to the gods. Inscribed stone vessels marked Booty of Elam or Booty of Magan show the habit persisted into Assyrian and later times. Human captives were among the most valuable prizes. Tablets from the Ur Third Era list large numbers of women and children. Men often do not appear, likely because they were killed, mutilated, or sacrificed. Royal propaganda boasted of heaps of enemy corpses buried in mounds, doomed, it was said, to trouble their descendants as restless spirits. Those who escaped siege or flight frequently died of hunger or disease. Cannibalism is mentioned but appears rare. Prisoners were driven long distances, sometimes naked, shackled at the neck or netted, hands bound. To economize on metal, many were blinded. Even then, they could perform basic labor like hauling water. Some captives became hostages for negotiations or were ransomed. Others worked for set terms in houses of bound men. Ration lists and death notices attest to these practices. Peace and alliance were formalized with oaths and ritual acts. Mari texts speak of slaughtering asses during treaty ceremonies. Agreements invoked the gods as guarantors and set terms for future conduct, succession, military aid, extradition, and borders. Breaking an oath was a religious offense. Vassal treaties, common in the first millennium BCE, spelled out the limits on a lesser king's diplomacy, trade, tribute, and military service. Overlords also pledged to defend vassal frontiers and even restore damaged foreign temples for the sake of those gods. Esarhaddon's famous loyalty oaths required periodic renewal, allegiance to his chosen heir, bans on poisoning or sorcery against the crown prince, mandatory reporting of plots, and blood-for-blood retribution against regicides, backed by terrifying curses calling for extinction of the offender's line. Babylonia posed a special problem for Assyria, too close and culturally intertwined to treat as a typical province. Assyrians alternated between installing client rulers, sometimes married to Assyrian princesses, and managing a delicate coexistence to keep invasion routes open. Annual Assyrian campaigns usually began in spring. A show of force often secured tribute without a fight. Payments ranged from fine goods to horses and stored grain for garrisons. Great provinces delivered substantial sums. Outlying regions sent token gifts. The diplomatic world was vibrant. Messengers crisscrossed borders, envoys negotiated, and rulers maintained extensive written correspondence, alongside ceremonial visits. Dynastic marriages cemented alliances, and audiences with kings required gifts and careful protocol. Access was tightly controlled, with palace officials acting as gatekeepers. Ambassadors enjoyed immunities, but could be recalled if troublesome, and returning home without a generous countergift was tantamount to a diplomatic snub. Conquest also produced assimilation, deportations, immigration, merchant communities abroad, and mixed marriages gradually folded outsiders into host societies. Assyrian policy even encouraged it. Sargon II populated his new capital with peoples of every tongue and installed Assyrian tutors and officials to shape loyalty. Interpreters bridged the linguistic gaps. Assurbanipal recounts receiving a messenger whose language no one in Nineveh could understand, an emblem of the empire's reach. From the second millennium onward, rulers wrote to one another in Akkadian, the lingua franca. Archives at Mari and Amarna preserve hundreds of letters. Address terms, father, son, brother, signaled rank. Sensitivities over status could spark friction, as when a rising Assyrian king's claim of brotherhood drew a tart Hittite rebuff. Etiquette demanded timely congratulations or inquiries on accessions and illnesses. Silence was an insult. Letters of introduction secured hospitality for high-status travelers, and treaties set reciprocal liability for crimes against foreign merchants, including triple compensation when killers were caught, or even when they were not. International relations extended to shared grief and state funerals. Assyrian vassal kings who died in battle could receive honors in Assyria. Hittite correspondence records formal mourning for a Babylonian king and the pledge to safeguard his heir, affirming that, as now, recognition of legitimate succession mattered to the wider community of powers. Mesopotamia nurtured some of the world's earliest farming villages, and by around 6000 BC, people there were already cultivating most of the staples later texts mention, managing herds of domesticated animals, and running organized irrigation, certainly in northern Babylonia. With hardy cereals like barley and wheat, canal water, and the traction of the plow, agriculture scaled up despite the region's harsh, semi-desert climate, turning it into antiquity's most productive breadbasket. Plants supplied roughly 9/10 of daily calories. The rest came from livestock, meat, milk, cheese, and eggs. Barley dominated the fields and even doubled as money. Wages were commonly paid in measured barley, and grain and dates sat at the heart of commerce. City administrations often steered farm policy to push yields higher, intensifying cultivation with frequent planting, mixed crops, and manuring, expanding arable acreage, and tapping new labor schemes. Because harvests could fail through flood, drought, blight, or locust swarms, survival also depended on storage, trade networks, and, at times, warfare. Letters and omen reports to kings even track locust threats, though in Assyria, locusts were also considered a delicacy. Low rainfall shaped the landscape. Except in the mountains that carried forests, most land needed irrigation, and vast cereal fields defined the view. A Sumerian didactic text, the Farmer's Instructions, blended practical tips with ritual reminders for this cereal-first economy. Harvesters used sickles with flint inserts, then poured grain, measured by volume, not weight, into tall, cylindrical silos raised on wooden grids to keep out damp and rats, with ladders for dumping sacks from above. Barley, tolerant of salt and dryness, anchored bread and beer. Emmer accompanied it. Millet is rarer early on. Rice arrives much later under Persian rule. Archives mostly reflect bulk staples for temples, palaces, and big estates rather than small garden plots, but kitchen crops were plentiful. Onions, garlic, leeks, turnips, lettuces, cucumbers, and spice seeds like cress, mustard, cumin, and coriander. Linseed, grown since before 6000 BCE, produced a fine edible oil that became an old Babylonian economic mainstay. Olive oil came only from foothill orchards. The date palm, first cultivated in the south, was unrivaled in utility. Fruit eaten fresh, dried or fermented, saplings yielding a celery-like heart, every part serviceable, and pollen transferred by hand from male to female trees. Word lists name more than 100 terms for palms and their parts. Dates and pomegranates were the common fruits, with apples, figs, pears, and a plum also known. Northern woods supplied tamarisk, poplar, willow, and a pine. Gums and resins scented perfumes and incense, and mastic served as ancient chewing gum. Animal keeping began in the Neolithic and ranged from hunting truly wild species to managed resources like fish ponds and bees to fully domesticated herds. Over time, reliance on gazelle, deer, and onager declined as settled economies favored stock animals that provided meat, milk, hides, wool, and hair. Sacrificial animals had to be unblemished and often white, and while many species were acceptable, sheep carried extra ritual weight. Their livers answered divine questions in extispicy. Economically, sheep were paramount across the Near East, chiefly for milk products and wool. Meat was more occasional, reserved for offerings, weddings, and gifts to officials. Specialists fattened males with richer rations for better flavor and fat. Sheep thrive in varied conditions, moving when rain fails. Goats often grazed with them, their hair becoming textiles and sacks. Ownership ranged from state and temples to private citizens. Big flocks bore brands, the gods' symbols on temple animals. Contracts detailed terms with shepherds, who might sublet to shepherd boys, received dairy and a set cut of wool, and had to account for losses. Disease or lion kills might be accepted if they produced skins and sinews, but negligence demanded repayment. Urban residents sometimes kept just a few animals. Records even joke about sheep on the roof. Techniques shifted from plucking molting wool to spring shearing by the mid-second millennium, with contracts tied to shearing and lambing seasons. Milk production appears in art. At Al-Ubaid, reed sheds shelter cows while milkers sit behind, then rock narrow-necked jars to separate butter before straining into wide-mouthed vessels. Fresh milk spoiled quickly in the heat and was used more in remedies and processing than as a drink. Ghee, cheese, and yogurt traveled better. As cities grew, pastures were pushed outward so fields could carry crops, and the Temple Palace complex managed large-scale herding and redistribution. Calculations from Neo-Sumerian wool deliveries suggest millions of sheep, an emphasis that diverted land to fodder and squeezed supplies of meat and milk. Many animals reached consumers through sacrificial channels. Refuse layers distinguish sacred slaughter from everyday butchery. Power farming and herding advanced together. Fifth millennium plow agriculture required traction, boosting cattle numbers. A Kassite seal shows a cedar plow behind two humped oxen, with a worker feeding grain into a funnel that drills seed into the furrow. Cattle were prized more for draft and dairy than for sacrifice, never used for liver omens, and demanded barleys and reeds beyond simple grazing. Ur III officials budgeted ox rations alongside seed in cultivation costs. Before horses, traction animals changed with technology and taste. Wild onagers hauled vehicles by the late 4th millennium. At Ur, Queen Puabi's sledge was drawn by them. Early Sumerians bred domestic donkeys with onagers for a swift, strong but sterile hybrid. After horses spread in the 2nd millennium, mules appeared for wagons but remained costlier than donkeys, which stayed the workaday pack animal of plow, cart, and overland merchant caravans, famously those of the Assyrian traders in Anatolia. Horses, literally nicknamed the mountain donkey for their upland origins, entered Mesopotamian life as chariot pullers in the 2nd millennium BC, and by the 1st, as cavalry mounts. They figured in oaths, offerings, and treaty rites, and their breeding and training were honed by Hurrian cities, the Hittites, and later Assyria, as surviving manuals attest. Kings, princes, magnates, and armies prized them. After about 900 BC, the best studs were in Armenia, northwest Iran, and the Levant, and Assyrian annals brag about seizing thousands as booty. White horses fetched exceptional prestige and were often presented to temples. Camels were latecomers, little used before the 1st millennium BC, and then chiefly by Arab nomads. Their nicknames, Donkey of the Sea or Donkey of the South, hint at their provenance. As camel herding matured into caravan trade at the millennium's start, imperial punishments against Arab groups in the 7th–6th centuries BC captured so many animals that prices collapsed. Dogs, among the earliest domesticates, guarded flocks and courtyards. 2 broad types are visible in the record: sleek greyhounds for the hunt and heavy mastiff-like herders. Dogs could be tied to healing cults, yet dog was also a slur. Cats hunted vermin in houses and competed with mongooses, which also killed snakes. Bones of lions, panthers, wolves, hyenas, foxes, wild boar, and jackals show a once rich fauna, later thinned by hunting and shrinking habitats. Guards defended farms and pens from both raiders and predators, using pits on game trails and special barbed heads, like those from Ur, to bleed and weaken quarry. Some wild creatures were tamed as pets, including gazelles and antelopes. The Asiatic elephant once ranged along great rivers from Syria eastward, its ivory a valued craft material. Birds, ducks, geese, mallards, storks, quail, and many more were netted, trapped, and decoyed. Eggs and meat mattered more than fish in many places, and one proverb wryly pairs the fowler's luck with the fisher's. Ancient texts even try to spell bird calls. Chickens moved in from the east only in the 1st millennium BC, reaching Greece by about 600 BC. Their bones multiply in later layers, and by late Persian and Hellenistic times, they were dietary staples. Francolins, partridges, geese, pigeons, and doves served as food and offerings. Geese appear in Babylonian breeding by the late 3rd millennium, ducks by the early 2nd, prized for both flesh and eggs. Exotic captives, ibis, cranes, herons, even pelicans trained to fish, joined a countryside alive with thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, larks, and a sky of raptors and carrion birds. The Near East lay on major flyways, so migrants crowded in spring and autumn. Honey was rare and costly when gathered wild. By the 3rd millennium BC, people were already keeping bees for honey and wax used in medicines and writing surfaces. A Babylonian inscription boasts of introducing the honey-collecting flies to a royal garden and knowing how to separate honey from wax by boiling, skills passed to palace gardeners. The region's cities ultimately rested on farming. Most people were cultivators, politics turned on irrigated yields, and myths echoed the seasonal anxiety over flood, drought, and storm. Early villages took root where rain sufficed and resources were diverse, but by about 5000 BC people began supplementing rainfall with guided flows on alluvial fans. Farmland was judged by water. The north lived mostly by dry farming, the south by canals. In rain-fed zones, barley, emmer, and wheat were sown, with fallow and rotation keeping soils productive. The system was extensive and resilient enough to tolerate bad years, and when peace and climate aligned, harvests could support dense cities even with modest seed returns. In the south, irrigation was essential, not least because salts accumulated early and threatened soils. Main channels fed branching distributors that often ran atop earthen embankments. Big courses could be more than 100 meters wide, while feeders narrowed to a meter or so and were deep enough to carry a steady head. Weirs lifted water, levees kept floods penned, breaches were stuffed with earth and reed bundles, baked brick quay walls set in bitumen-armored banks, and gravel-lined beds fought scouring, techniques recorded as early as the 3rd millennium BC. Kings made canal works both state duty and pious deed. Local authorities dredged silt, and rivers and canals watered fields, cooled bankside groves, and served people and animals alike. Because snowmelt swelled the Tigris and Euphrates in spring, exactly when crops stood high. Flood control and gravity-fed timing were everything, and constant evaporation and seepage made careful scheduling vital. Farmers struggled against salinization with laborious reclamation. Practical irrigation boiled down to getting water to arable land, holding it there, draining it off, and keeping out unwelcome flows. Small plots and gardens were hand-watered from wells or streams, but cereals thrived best under controlled downhill distribution. Simple outlets, holes opened in a bank, let water into distributaries. Temporary mats of reeds or permanent brick and bitumen regulators raised levels as needed. Gardeners stacked life vertically, date palms above, fruit trees under their shade, and vegetables and herbs below, a 3-tiered shade garden that, in Sumerian story, was inspired by the gods to spare tender plants the scorching winds. In those layered groves, palms sheltered citrus, pomegranate, and apple. Peas, beans, lentils, leeks, cucumbers, lettuces, and garlic, and seasonings like cumin, coriander, mustard, and watercress. The same pattern still shapes Iraqi date and tamarisk stands, a double canopy for a 3rd layer of crops. Pleasure parks drew water by hand from wells and ponds. Modest house plots did the same. Fruit tree domestication differed from annuals. Cuttings and grafts made orchards a long investment, so the earliest tree crops were those easy to propagate and store: olives in brine, grapes, figs, and dates dried for off-season use, followed by grafted apples, pears, plums, and cherries once techniques matured. Such groves flaunted status. Assyrian kings planted oil trees in their parks, and olive thrived in Assyria, though not in Babylonia. Descendants of 1st millennium plantings still grow around Nineveh and Nimrud. Nebuchadnezzar II is credited with creating the famed hanging gardens, tiered, irrigated terraces planted with exotic trees to delight his queen. Beyond such royal showpieces, fishing long supplemented everyday diets. Nets, fixed or cast, did most of the work, but spears, harpoons, baskets, and only occasionally rods were used, since many river fish were large. People fished from banks and boats. Sailcraft ventured onto open water. Baskets held the catch. Carp were common, and texts list dozens of fish names, though many terms are now obscure. Salt preserved fish, and turtles and their eggs were eaten as well. Later, references to fishing decline. In Neo-Babylonian Uruk, the very word for fisherman even drifted toward criminal. On land, the alluvial plain's flatness and poor drainage posed constant challenges. By about 2000 BC, salinity had become a documented problem. Canals were recut to flush salts, but when irrigation failed, people abandoned fields and moved, especially northward in the early 2nd millennium, in search of better soils. Cereal farming and large-scale date cultivation operated at several scales. Vast temple and palace domains, private holdings, and small allotments for the urban poor, nomads, and herders. Surviving records skew toward institutional estates, so the everyday picture is surely broader than the archives suggest. Over time, urban dwellers increasingly rented land to private farmers and partnerships, peaking in the Neo-Babylonian era, while reliance on slaves and bonded labor for fieldwork diminished. A typical farmer drove the plow while helpers sped the work. A team might plow roughly 1 EQ a day. Seed plows covered about 2 IQ daily. In the Akkadian period, family plots often ran 4 to 10 IQ, enough to sustain a household. Farming was capital-intensive. Seed, tools, and especially draft animals cost dearly. Working oxen needed quality feed, barley during the season at about 1 measure of fodder per 2 measures of seed sown. Laborers were provisioned in rations or a share of the harvest. Big irrigation jobs were scheduled for slack times. In the Old Babylonian period, a slave averaged approximately 20 shekels of silver, with extremes up to 90, while a hired hand earned approximately 10 shekels a year, making seasonal hire cheaper than ownership. Tenant farming dominated. The landlord supplied seed, animals, and implements. The tenant paid a fixed share of the yield. Productive farms matched tasks to landscapes across irrigation zones. Households kept poultry and sometimes a sheep or goat. Women oversaw domestic weaving and stock care, but most families still depended on specialists around them. Marshes, reed beds, and scrublands, the herders, fishermen's, and fowlers' domains, supplied food, fuel, and raw materials. Herds grazed away from fields except when needed for plowing, threshing, or stubble gleaning. Royal and elite households relied on extensive lands. Mid-rank officials and soldiers held smaller, comfortable plots, often lightly assessed. Prosperous smallholders were numerous, though equal inheritance and alternating fallow could fragment holdings as generations passed. Tenants on great estates often slid into dependency, especially with chronic labor shortages. Loans frequently bound debtors to work a creditor's fields, ensuring elite harvests at peak times. At threshing, the crop was commonly split, 1/3 to the landlord, 2/3 to the tenant. Texts label farmers as a rural sub-elite responsible for production and taxes, with revenue responsibility subcontracted down the chain. Shares moved upward at every level, from field hand to local officer to ruler, and ultimately to the god. The most detailed picture of organized agriculture comes from Sumer, under the 3rd dynasty of Ur. The year began at the spring equinox, with half the fields in grain and half lying fallow to be flooded and leached of salts in preparation for plowing. Harvests ran from mid-April into June. Early autumn rains or preliminary irrigation prepped fields. Fallow plots were cleared and leveled with timber drags. A 3-man team with 4 oxen cut the first autumn furrows. Lighter operations used 2 oxen, or even donkeys, handled by 1 man. Deep furrows meant better yields. Wooden plow points were best tipped with metal. Fields took their shape from water and teams. Long, narrow strips along canals, the length of a single furrow so animals could rest and drink at each turn. Sowing began in October with seed plows or by hand drilling followed by a plow. Irrigation then flushed salts. A classic farming text recommends 3 waterings during growth, with a 4th late pass adding roughly 10% to the yield. Barley, salt-tolerant, was the mainstay. Temples and palaces functioned as giant households, provisioning staff with food, oil, and clothing. In early dynastic cities, the temple economy was indistinguishable from civic and political life. Architecture reflects the wealth of a priestly secular elite. Temples farmed their own lands, granted fiefs to personnel and citizens, and rented plots on shares. They ran granaries, mills, bakeries, and herds. Outside the sanctuaries, rulers, officials, priests, and free citizens held lands, often as family property. Many free people still depended on temple, palace, or noble estates and received land in return for service. With an able heir, such grants could become hereditary. Landless folk, craftsmen, wage laborers, sharecroppers, worked in institutional estates or royal administration. As palaces grew, they rivaled temples in splendor. And by Ur III, a vast bureaucracy tracked everything entering or leaving temple and palace, naming all parties involved. State-managed production and redistribution knit together cities, villages, and camps with constant political-economic realignment. Profitable wool and leather industries rode on control of state flocks. Shulgi imposed monthly quotas across provinces to fund sacrifices and temple maintenance at Nippur. At the top sat the royal government with estates, workshops, and trading hubs. Temples held their own endowments, and a wealthy bureaucratic class prospered on taxes and estate returns. Royal storehouses fed the court, officials, household staff, the army, and dependents. Merchants, the emerging middle tier, thrived on long-distance trade. The system rested on working people, state laborers and taxpayers, smallholders, tenants, and slaves. Long-distance trade was a royal preserve. Officials imported metals, copper, tin, specialty foods, resins and aromatics, fruit trees and herbs, tanning and dyeing agents, ship timber, tortoiseshell, and more. In exchange, they shipped bulky staples Mesopotamia produced in surplus: wool, barley, wheat, dates, dried fish and fish oil, and raw and finished hides. Silver balanced accounts and increasingly served as money, medium of exchange, unit of account, and standard of value. Though much trade still settled in kind and arable land, remained communally and institutionally held. Institutional wealth financed risky expansions into marginal lands and investments in irrigation, livestock breeds, plant varieties, and tools. They optimized outputs with sheep fattening stations and careful sowing calculations. In official records, rent and tax blur. The countryside appears as a dependent labor landscape paid largely in rations. Subsistence and poverty rarely enter the ledgers. Surveyors measured wet ground before plowing to mark boundaries, register cultivable parcels, and assign workers. Leases were dated after harvest. Revenues were assessed in barley at communal threshing floors that doubled as tax collection points. Typical leases ran 2 to 3 years, with rent as a percentage of yield or like neighboring fields. Communities paid fees to maintain canals. Tenants opening new land negotiated special terms. Officials recognized soil variability and factored it into planning. A Shulgi-era register classifies parcels as good, middling, with or without grass, plowed but failed, reclaimed, brought out of water, flooded, poor, canal or dike, bridges, wells, orchards, villages, and ancient mounds. Trade also reached the Indus world, source or entrepot for black wood, gold, ivory, and carnelian. A Meluha interpreter is mentioned, and a Meluhan village appears under Shulgi near Lagash, evidence of sea routes up the Gulf 2300 to 2000 BC. Under the Kassits, the Kuduru, a carved boundary stone, recorded royal land grants lodged in temples or on site, with tablet copies for owners. These grants, often to temples or loyal servants, removed fertile fields from tax rolls, like city privileges, Kidinu. Kuduru reliefs display divine symbols, signaling sacred protection of those entitlements. Public proclamations of private land sales, complete with accurate surveys, formalized transactions if unchallenged. Across periods, society consistently polarizes around landholding, those who owned and those who depended. Private, literary, and legal texts, Hammurabi's included, highlight individual rights alongside institutional power. Many people were legally free, tied neither to temple nor palace. In Amorite Babylonia, the private sector, landed property worked by hired hands or slaves, flourished, echoing Akkadian precedents. Ration systems gave way to fiefs, land grants tied to military or civil duties, sometimes fulfilled by substitutes. Palaces and temples retained large estates, but tenant farming remained the dominant operating model. The institution supplied inputs. The cultivator returned a fixed share of the harvest. Temples might glitter with gold, silver, and lapis, but ordinary old Babylonian households owned much simpler things, and everyday shopping seems to have happened in small stalls along buying streets and at gates used for exchange with itinerant sellers in the mix. Dowries and inheritances list what people actually had: textiles, a bed or two, some chairs, a bronze cup and platter, maybe a pair of gold earrings. From Ur III records, we can trace work and pay with unusual clarity. Wages were figured per day and rations per month. A canonical schoolroom figure set the daily wage at 10 liters of barley, about 2.5 gallons, for 2 millennia, though real contracts often paid less. Men's monthly rations might be 2 liters of bread and 2 of beer, bare bones if they fed a family, plus about 2 kilograms of wool a year, scarcely enough for one garment. New Year or other feast days could bring bonus barley, meat, and oil. Mid- and high-ranking officials lived off subsistence fields, ranging from roughly 15 to 90 acres. Workers did drift away or disappear. Pension-like support shows up too. Cloistered women were to receive large barley allotments, a little oil, wool, and flour from their designated heirs. Sons were expected to keep elderly fathers comfortable. Debt was a trap. Interest commonly ran at about 20% for silver and 12% for grain, with penalties on top for late payment. When a borrower fell behind, the repayment often became labor on the creditor's land. Omen texts mirror social anxiety from both directions: the poor dreaming of wealth, the rich dreading a fall, and everyone wary of palace interference. By Ur III, accounting itself had become a social technology. Tablets balance receipts and outlays over roughly 6 or 12-month periods of 30-day months, rolling forward totals and even counting the days after a laborer's death in both debit and credit, actual. Time off wasn't weekly or rigid. Breaks varied by task and stamina, with men and women treated differently in practice. Institutional merchants retailed wool, oil, fish, dates, figs, barley, wheat, and silver on behalf of palace or temple. They also brought in what estates could not produce: bitumen, gypsum, feathers, fruits, and other specialties. Grain seldom appears in palace merchant accounts, likely because estates already pulled in more than enough through rent and their own acreage. Grain also acted as a unit of account or medium of payment, muddying market visibility. Farmland was priced by expected yield. Rents typically returned 1/3 to 1/2 of the crop to the owner, with shares adjusted if the landlord supplied seed, animals, and tools or paid taxes. Later, great firms, Egibi of Babylon, and in the 5th century BC, Murashu of Nippur, managed fields for absentee elites, leased royal lands to tenants, and converted agricultural surplus into metal. There was more arable land than labor to work it. so law codes pressed tenants to keep fields and dikes in good order. Individual farmers gained most by intensively cultivating smaller areas. Owners gained most by expanding acreage. Under Persian rule, political calm favored accumulation. Private archives, often extending earlier Neo-Babylonian ledgers, show large numbers of people lending and trading on a silver standard, mostly within their own towns. Two houses, Egibi and Murashu, range wider, Egibi across Babylonia and occasionally into Iran, Murashu dominating central Babylonia, while international long-haul trade is largely in non-Babylonian hands. Deal forms are consistent. A promissory tablet identifies the commodity metal or produce, lender and borrower, term, interest, collateral, witnesses, scribe, place, and date. On repayment, the tablet returns to the debtor and is usually broken. If not, a receipt tablet substitutes. Joint ventures pool capital from 2 to 5 backers, front it to an agent to trade, then split profits pro rata or by a fixed return plus a sweetener. Templates also used for partnerships. Silver sat at the center of valuation long before coin. In Ur, 3 balance sheets, all inflows and purchases are priced in silver by weight, so accounts balance, even when no metal changes hands. In Old Babylonian practice, prices are in silver, but payment in actual silver is rare, and the texts don't fuss over fineness, suggesting accounting rather than settlement metal. By Neo-Babylonian times, scribes distinguish qualities of silver in detail, and the palace polices its circulation. Coinage itself begins outside. Electrum pieces in Lydia around 650 BC. Greek coinage follows a bit later. Assyrian texts use half shekels as a casting benchmark for bronze long before coins circulate, and the breakthrough in Mesopotamia seems to be small stamped silver pieces. Then, in 493 BC, Darius I formally introduces silver coin to the empire. In the Seleucid Age, weight and issuing ruler set value, and private banking booms, with lenders amassing fortunes at steep rates. Before coin, money took many forms. Administrations cast spiral silver rings of set weights, often 5-shekel coils, but also 1 to 10, alongside stamped sheets, blocks, shavings, bracelets, and other breakable shapes. Units were traditional. 1 mina, 60 shekels to the mina, 60 minas to the talent. Silver paid taxes, bought land and slaves, and underwrote finance. Copper stipends to workers served petty purchases. Other metals, copper, tin, bronze, gold, circulated at fixed ratios. Transactions were by weight. A chunk was broken to size on a scale, so routine that the word for silver also means the broken thing, and specialized terms name the fragments. We have sets of weights, but no complete balances. Even in coin-using eras, pieces are weighed. Officials distrust face value, and evidence of shaving and counterfeiting is common. Trade in ancient Mesopotamia was a wide and complex system that linked cities, regions, and distant lands. Evidence for this comes from contracts, letters, inscriptions, and the discovery of foreign objects at archaeological sites. Goods made in workshops tied to temples and palaces were exchanged for resources such as metals, stone, wood, spices, and perfumes. Foreign trade followed major routes, particularly along the Persian Gulf and up the Euphrates toward the Mediterranean. This exchange not only provided material wealth, but also spread Mesopotamian culture beyond its borders. While daily needs like cereals, dates, animals, hides, clay, and basic construction materials were available locally, rare and luxury goods were sought for the prestige of rulers, palaces, and temples. These items included lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory, and fine metals, often acquired through difficult and dangerous journeys by land or sea. Powerful rulers controlled much of this trade. Sargon of Akkad created the first empire by seizing control of key cities such as Mari and Ebla, which were central to wine and metal distribution. Expansion into regions like Elam brought even more resources under imperial authority. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, trade became tightly regulated. The Hittites, for example, limited Anatolian merchants in Ugarit to protect local traders, restricting them to seasonal trade and denying rights to buy land or houses. In later centuries, the Assyrians strengthened their influence by demanding tribute, but records also show clear evidence of independent commercial activity, such as a contract listing the receipt of hundreds of horses vital for warfare. Tribute and trade thus existed side by side, with goods like ivory and lapis lazuli flowing into the empire from many directions. Transportation played a crucial role in keeping this system alive. Rivers such as the Tigris and Euphrates, supported by a network of canals, provided the most efficient means of moving goods. Ships sailed through the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, sometimes influenced by Levantine and Aegean designs. When rivers could not be used, donkeys, mules, sledges, and carts carried loads across the land. Sledges were even used to haul the massive stone colossi of Assyrian palaces. Roads were primitive but necessary, often little more than dirt tracks that shifted over time, though some bridges and paved sections were created in larger cities. The Urartians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all invested in road building to secure mountain routes or river crossings. These routes served both merchants and armies, and failure to protect caravans could trigger conflict. Trade agreements between rulers ensured safe passage, while records from places like Cappadocia reveal traders also used hidden smugglers' roads to bypass taxes. Travel itineraries show that long-distance journeys could last many months, winding through complex networks of stops and detours. Messengers, envoys, and merchants often overlapped in role, acting as carriers of both goods and information. Their routes, used for centuries, became arteries of diplomacy, commerce, and war. In this way, trade was not simply about goods, but about the very connections that bound Mesopotamia to the wider ancient world, sustaining its prosperity and extending its influence across regions. The Syro-Palestinian trade routes were essential links in the ancient world, stretching both lengthwise and across the land. Their position between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean made them vital for the exchange of goods. From these routes, Syria imported raw materials and also exported timber, wool, oil, wine, textiles, and fine crafts. References from poetry recall the grandeur of earlier times, describing exotic animals like elephants and apes arriving in marketplaces, creatures that could only have come from distant lands such as India. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire rose to power between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, it inherited existing roads but did not significantly expand them. The key change was that the central administration took direct control of the road system. This allowed for faster communication with the capital, efficient movement of troops, and reliable postal services. Roads were carefully measured using cords, with distances recorded in precise units. These royal highways became permanent features, even marking boundaries in land sales. Stations built along the way provided rest stops for soldiers and travelers, while mounted couriers carried messages from station to station. Kings like Sargon II and Sennacherib even paved sections near their capitals, marking them with milestones. Yet most paved stretches quickly gave way to rough tracks, a practice abandoned until the Roman road systems much later. Desert routes were opened with the use of camels, which the Assyrians bred in large numbers. Caravans became the safest way to travel, especially through deserts and mountains where guides and escorts were essential. Journeys were often made at night during the hot summer months. Goods could be moved by wagons, pulled by oxen or donkeys, but most long-distance transport relied on caravans of donkeys and, later, camels. Records show that donkeys could carry up to 75 kilograms, covering about 25 to 30 kilometers a day. Heavy goods like timber required specially maintained wagon tracks and great effort to build mountain roads. Despite these difficulties, caravans made trade possible across long distances, offering protection from raiders and wild animals while keeping transport costs manageable. River and sea routes were just as important as land. In Mesopotamia, rivers and canals formed a dense transport network. Boats carried food, livestock, building materials, and people, and clay maps of canals have been discovered. Seagoing ships also ventured far beyond the Gulf, linking Mesopotamia to regions as distant as the Indus Valley. Ports like Dilmun acted as trading hubs for gold, copper, pearls, ivory, and timber. Oman, known as Magan, supplied copper and stone, while Melucca traded ebony, ivory, carnelian, and gold. These goods often reached Mesopotamia under strict royal supervision, with checkpoints along rivers ensuring official control. Despite the importance of maritime commerce, descriptions of the ships remain vague. They are mentioned in texts as large ships, short ships, or wide cargo ships, and a few seal impressions give only limited images. Some evidence suggests that ships sailed from Harappan ports and along the Arabian coast as early as the 3rd millennium BC. Goods were packed in vessels that navigated through lagoons and bays to islands like Failaka and Bahrain. By the 1st millennium BC, Elamite traders controlled much of this traffic, while routes around Arabia and into the Red Sea were already active by 3000 BC. Navigation relied on simple techniques. Barges were pushed or towed upstream, taking weeks to cover distances that downstream currents allowed in only a few days. Larger ships required organized shipyards and skilled boatwrights, with evidence that massive wooden ships carried cargo to faraway places. Shipwrecks in the Persian Gulf illustrate the risks of long voyages. Merchants often avoided full financial partnerships because of the dangers at sea, and sailors sometimes dedicated silver ship models to their gods in thanks for safe journeys. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from the Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, dating to the 14th century BC. The vessel carried a vast and varied cargo: silver, tin, copper, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, oils, nuts, spices, and other goods. Its route linked Phoenicia, Crete, and Egypt in a great circuit of exchange. Navigation was still basic, using sounding rods rather than instruments, yet such voyages reveal the impressive scale of international trade. Together, the land and sea networks made the Near East a center of global interaction in antiquity. Caravans and ships carried not only goods, but also cultural connections, ensuring that distant regions remained tied to the economies and ambitions of Mesopotamian and Near Eastern states for centuries. In the 1st millennium BC, seafaring in the Levant was dominated by the Canaanites and later by the Phoenicians, whose ships became essential for trade and war. The Assyrian kings relied heavily on Phoenician sailors and craftsmen to build and man their fleets. By the 8th century BC, warships equipped with bronze-covered rams appeared, designed to smash into enemy vessels. Oars were passed through small ports cut into the hull, protecting rowers during naval combat. A century later, ships were developed with two tiers of oarsmen, the lower row beneath the deck and the upper row above. Shields were mounted along the sides of the deck to defend soldiers standing above the rowers. Maritime activity was highly regulated. Laws going back to the 2nd millennium BC set rules for navigation, ship hire, salvage, and crew wages. Even Hammurabi's code included details about boat construction, fixing rates for caulking, and holding the worker responsible if the boat leaked within a year. In Mesopotamia, two traditional boats, the coracle and the raft-like kelek, were widely used and still survive in similar forms today. The coracle, a round basket-like vessel made of woven reeds and covered in skins, floated low on the water but was surprisingly effective for river crossings. The kelek was a raft supported by inflated goatskins, which could withstand river rapids. Once downstream journeys ended, the rafts were dismantled, their wood sold, and the skins packed onto donkeys for reuse elsewhere. Canoes made of wood were also common, propelled with paddles or poles, much like those still seen in Mesopotamian marshes. Crossing Mesopotamia's canals often required simple floats or inflated skins. People tied the openings of animal hides to trap air inside and used them as buoyancy aids to swim across rivers. Soldiers in Assyria were even issued such skins for river crossings. Major Assyrian capitals like Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh were built on the Tigris to take advantage of water transport. At Nimrud, massive quay walls were constructed with stone blocks to provide access for unloading heavy cargoes, while Sennacherib's Nineveh included a quay gate. These harbors collected tolls and were used for transporting huge stone statues and other materials needed for royal building projects. Trade colonies established by old Assyrian merchants in Anatolia provide some of the richest details of early commercial life. Thousands of letters and contracts reveal how textiles from Ashur were exchanged for silver and gold in Asia Minor, while tin, likely from Afghanistan, was transported by caravans and sold at great profit. Merchants traveled with donkeys carrying loads of up to 90 kilograms each, paying taxes and customs duties at various points along their route. Their profits could be high, and the trade supported multiple generations of merchant families. These traders also enjoyed considerable social prestige and emphasized their ethical standards in their records. For over a century, caravans moved steadily between Ashur and Kanesh, the central Anatolian trading colony. Business disputes, inheritance arrangements, loans, and partnerships were all recorded in the tablets found there. The Assyrians lived in their own merchant quarter, called the Karum, which originally meant quay or wharf, but came to mean the community of traders itself. Trade was organized through family firms. The senior members remained in Ashur, while younger relatives managed affairs at Kanesh. Partnerships were sometimes formed to raise larger amounts of capital, and taxes were paid to local rulers for protection and permission to operate. Beyond the large-scale operations, there were also small merchants who functioned more like shopkeepers or peddlers, selling directly to individuals. Some carried bags of weights, others were known as firewood men or salt men, moving door to door with their goods. While some traders engaged in dishonest practices by tampering with weights, many operated within the framework of trust and regulation. Temples and wealthy individuals also financed trade by lending silver to merchants, who repaid either in goods, at favorable prices, or with interest. Trade routes linked distant regions through cities like Mari, which served as a hub for the tin trade between Asia and the Mediterranean, and facilitated exchanges connecting the Persian Gulf with Syria and beyond. Merchants often doubled as envoys, carrying gifts between rulers under treaties that promised protection. Even so, the dangers were high, and many lost their lives to bandits or political turmoil. Despite periods of disruption, long-distance commerce never disappeared. It shifted hands and routes, eventually thriving again under the Aramaeans and Arabs, who managed the caravan networks stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Asia. Through these evolving systems, river transport, caravans, colonies, and maritime ventures, trade shaped the economies and cultures of the ancient Near East. It sustained great empires, enriched families, and connected regions in a vast web of exchange that endured for centuries. In Sumerian and Akkadian, a single term denoted the specialist, covering skilled artisans, artists, and learned professionals whose expertise was acquired through oral instruction, long apprenticeships, and, for scribes, written training. Crafts commonly passed within families or clans, and even the law protected such transmission, barring the reclamation of an adopted child once a craft had been taught. Apprenticeships could be lengthy, about 8 years for a house builder and 4 for a seal cutter, and wealthy households sometimes trained enslaved workers. Many surviving apprenticeship contracts involve the powerful Egibi family. From the Ur Third period, we have records of a large, compartmentalized jewelry and crafts establishment with departments for metalworkers, goldsmiths, stonecutters, blacksmiths, leather workers, felters, carpenters, and reed workers, receiving materials and issuing orders. In the Old Babylonian era, palace or temple-attached guild-like groupings of brewers, smiths, weavers, and others formed under administrators. Some categories gained partial autonomy and well-paid overseers, though positions with little to hire or sell, such as the supervisor of musicians, brought modest income. True medieval-style guild independence was impossible because access to raw materials remained controlled. By early Neo-Babylonian times, professional titles hardened into family names, much like smith, weaver, or miller, reflecting prior status. Many were scribes, but carpenters, metalworkers, and goldsmiths also appear, with lineages traceable to Kassite days. Cities sometimes set aside quarters for particular trades: the city of tanners, the city of metalworkers, concentrating noisy, odorous, or fire-risk crafts for practicality and oversight. Material culture evolved under court taste and technical change. Innovations could uplift quality or simply enable mass production of inferior goods. Either way, acceptance depended on local taste, and elite court style spawned humbler imitations. Kassite cylinder seals reveal parallel styles for rich and poor, while deliberate archaism thrived. Artists revived old forms, copied revered pieces, and treasured relics like the stele of Naram-Sin remained on view for a millennium. People even scoured old sites for beads and ornaments. Knowledge likely moved through elders' instruction, clay models, and perhaps pattern books. Motifs recur across media from cylinder seals to reliefs. Quality language in records mostly tracks cost. Metalwork was priced by weight, with an added premium, often higher on small objects, for workmanship, while monumental pieces, commissioned by rulers or temples, had little market value except as scrap. Archaeology recovers crucibles, filtering and distillation gear, drip bottles, mortars, pestles, strainers, and mills, alongside technical vocabulary that reaches back to prehistory. By the first millennium BCE, Assyrian and Babylonian practitioners knew acids, including sulfuric, alkalis, silicates, limes, metals, and oxides, and even described igniting sulfur, though the ignition method is unclear. Woodworking underpinned bridges, wagons, ships, and some houses. Textual lists of wooden items surpass those for copper, clay, or leather, because wood rarely survives except charred in desert contexts. Trained carpenters supplied temples and palaces with imported timbers. Cypress, cedar, beech floated downriver as great trunks to become doors and beams, though our picture of their tools is fragmentary. Pottery, the most ubiquitous craft, furnished pots, cups, plates, bowls, storage jars, ovens, and even coffins. Techniques ranged from hand-forming with pellets and coils to mold pressing and wheel throwing, despite no clear Akkadian term for potter's wheel. Abundant clay, water, fuel, and iron-rich pigments favored mass production, with kiln atmospheres shifting wares from red to gray or black. Kilns ran from brush-covered hearth stacks and trench or seawall windbreaks to tall cylindrical updraft structures. Specialization produced painted, enameled, and glazed wares, especially in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian contexts, likely cross-pollinating with glass and metal workshops. Inscriptions appear on vessels from tiny sizes to giants of 250 liters. Workshop gender roles are uncertain. Men may have managed full-time production with apprentices while women decorated. In any case, regional styles help date sites and trace exchange. Clay also yielded the bulk of small sculpture. Molded terracottas, often two-part molds for three-dimensional figures, were fired, painted, and later glazed. Brickmaking, though rarely named as a profession, mobilized huge labor forces. Mud was formed in wooden molds, sun-dried, sometimes fired, then stamped and counted. Later, Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian builders created embossed and brilliantly glazed relief bricks: blue, turquoise, green, yellow, white, black. On monuments such as the Ishtar Gate, often using artificial lapis glazes and asphaltic waterproofing. Glassworking, attested textually from Sumerian times, though archaeologically secure after circa 1500 BCE, grew from experiments with lime soda silicates and mineral colorants into glazes, frits, opaque and translucent glasses formed into containers, beads, figurines, and inlays. Hot glass could be rolled, drawn, cut, or pressed, but demanded swift handling as it shifted rapidly from viscous to solid. Textile production, spinning and weaving flax and wool, was largely women's work. After training, weavers specialized in linen, colored fabrics, or fine grades, and skilled fullers, men and women, finished cloth. Looms included portable ground looms, favored by nomads, and warp-weighted looms, known from weights and imagery. Perforated beads served as spindle whorls, grooved beads as bobbins, and bone knives appear with carpet work. Dyes came from animals, plants, and minerals. The famed purple from coastal murex made Phoenician cloth a luxury, alongside reds, yellows, blues, and blacks. Textile trades ranged from sack makers to rug and tapestry producers, with pile knotting likely maturing after 1500 BC. Rugs warmed floors and walls across nomadic and settled settings, though physical evidence is thin before the 8th century BC. Sewing, probably done by women, left little lexical trace, yet court and cult demanded exquisite garments for kings, priests, and divine statues. Many ancient textile techniques endure today. Felt roofing, rope rigging and hoisting, linen for heat, wool for cold, and sackcloth for bulk goods. Practical continuities linking everyday life with the refined arts and sciences of Mesopotamian craft. Basketry overlapped with weaving, since many objects could be produced by either method. Even ship sails might be made from woven fibers or heavy canvas. Basket makers fashioned round hampers, boxes, seats, and the cheapest coffins from thick reed ropes, a material vital in treeless wetlands where reeds were abundant along rivers and marshes. Reeds served countless purposes: baskets, arrow and spear shafts, fences, doors, furniture, mats, boats, animal and human shelters, and were incorporated into construction. Reed mats were laid between brick courses in ziggurats and used as roofing, where carbonized remains are often found. Leatherworking followed elaborate tanning routines. Hides were dehaired with agents like oak galls, bark, alum, fats, and oils, then soaked, worked with oils and even manure to soften them, and sometimes dyed by unknown recipes. Leather supplied sandals and boots, and crucially, military kit, straps and liners for helmets, shields and armor, as well as quivers, chariot fittings, and bridles. Assyrian stone art is famed for palace reliefs at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Dur-Sharrukin, which translate painted wall programs into carved narrative cycles of rites, myth, hunting, and war. Perspective was conventionalized. Figures are shown with heads in profile, torsos fronted or slightly turned, pelvis and legs in profile with feet aligned, and rank indicated by scale. Landscapes are signaled by emblematic flora, northern vines, southern palms, and conifers. By late Neo-Assyrian times, figures shrink, and scenes bristle with chariots, horses, and combat. Artists used formulae, galloping horses with outstretched legs, echoed outlines to suggest multiple persons or animals, and engineered effects like the five-legged lamassu, so it reads correctly frontally and in profile. Color accents, not full polychromy, picked out beards, ornaments, and garments. Large projects began at quarries near the site. Blocks were roughed out, hauled by boat, rollers, sledges, ropes, animals, and teams of workers up earthen and wooden ramps. Specialist stoneworkers and picture carvers left marks on blocks. Finished pieces were often painted and given inlaid eyes of shell or lapis set in bitumen. Long traditions of wall painting used fine mud plaster grounds and mineral pigments, carbon black, azurite, ochres, malachite, bound with gums, gelatin, albumen, or wax, applied with fibrous wood brushes. Seals, integral to administration since writing began, authenticated agreements when rolled across clay. Cylinders were cut from hard, colorful stones: jasper, serpentine, quartz, hematite, lapis, with colors thought to affect owners' fates. Officials changed seals as ranks, or kings changed. Rulers had multiple personal and dynastic seals, and even divine statues were imagined sealing letters. Seals hung from wrist pins or necklaces. The Sumerian word for wrist literally means seal holder, and accompanied owners and spouses to the grave, as seen with Queen Puabi's lapis seal. Metalworking workshops and foundries, evidenced by tool hoards and scrap, tracked and remelted weights of metal. Copper dominated early, with rich Anatolian ores and native copper along a mineral belt into northern Iraq. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamians pivoted to Gulf copper, drawing huge consignments through Dilmun and Magan, Oman. Texts list the full metallic repertoire: copper, tin, bronze, gold, silver, electrum, lead, iron, and carbon steel, plus arsenical copper and brass, while noting that before approximately 1000 BCE, only copper, lead, and silver ores were mined locally. Tin and gold were panned or sourced from vein deposits in granite. Refining washed copper multiple times at heavy loss. Smelting with charcoal reduced ores, and casting required proper crucibles. Work hardening by hammering demanded annealing to restore malleability, and advanced techniques like lost wax casting were in use by the 4th millennium BCE. Together, these crafts, reedwork, leather, stone carving and painting, sealing, and metal, formed an interlocking technical world where raw materials, workshop knowledge, and administrative needs shaped the objects, buildings, and images of the ancient Near East. The Iron Age began around 1200 BCE, though scattered pieces of worked iron appear as far back as the 5th millennium. Once smelting and forging became established, the craft developed quickly. Early tradition suggested that ironworking was a closely guarded secret, with the Hittites mastering the technology and using it effectively in the battle, as at Kadesh against Egypt around 1275 BCE. After their empire collapsed, the knowledge spread, and the Philistines in particular gained prominence as iron users. From then on, iron shifted from a rare material more precious than gold to the metal of ordinary use. The smith, whether goldsmith, coppersmith, or ironsmith, became an essential figure. Smelting and forging iron required more complex methods than copper or bronze, involving processes like carburizing, quenching, and tempering to produce wrought iron and steel. Bronze, however, continued to be used for everyday tools, nails, and vessels. Yet the dangers of metallurgy were real. Arsenic used in alloys poisoned many smiths, possibly inspiring myths of crippled gods of the forge, from Hephaestus and Vulcan to figures in northern Europe and Africa. Workshops for metal have rarely been found, though a few 2nd millennium BCE sites such as Kanesh and Eshnuna yielded molds, crucibles, and bellows pipes. Bronze was favored for larger sculptures, as gold and silver were too costly, and regions like Urartu became centers of metal artistry around 650 to 600 BCE. The craftsmanship of pieces like the colossal statue of Queen Napir-Assu of Elam, cast in 2 massive sections with multiple crucibles pouring molten bronze at once, demonstrates technical skills not equaled in the West until the 19th century. Jewelry production combined delicate sheet metal with vivid stones. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and pins were fashioned from gold, silver, and electrum, often enriched with agate, jasper, carnelian, and lapis lazuli. Craftsmen developed methods to imitate scarce gems by coloring and firing quartz pebbles. While carnelian could be enhanced with heat and chemicals, jewelers also worked on luxury items such as ceremonial weapons, statuettes, and inlaid furniture, and their skills passed through family lines rather than guilds. A jeweler's hoard discovered at Larsa held tools, weights, and raw materials, showing the scope of their trade. Finds from Ur reveal techniques like granulation, cloisonné, repoussé, engraving, and filigree already in use, with elaborate diadems, earrings, and figurines combining metals and stones in striking detail. 2 famous goat statues from Ur, inlaid with gold, lapis lazuli, shell, and silver, show how varied materials were blended into one piece. The Mari archives even record orders for elaborate jewelry, with long lists of beads and gold fittings supplied to wealthy patrons. Ivory carving, often in the hands of Phoenician and Syrian artisans, supplied Mesopotamian courts with decorated furniture, boxes, spoons, combs, and plaques. Reliefs showed gods, animals, and mythic beings, sometimes dyed, gilded, or inlaid with other materials. Ivory, shell, bone, and mother of pearl were widely used for inlays on gaming boards, instruments, and ornaments, while ostrich eggshells and tortoise shells found roles in luxury goods. Music and song formed another part of the economy. Songs were bought and sold, though never highly paid. Surviving titles suggest both sacred and secular themes, ranging from hymns to love songs. Mesopotamians also laid foundations for music theory. By 1800 BCE, 7- and 8-tone scales resembling later Greek and modern scales were in use. Instruments of wind, string, and percussion are attested, though performance style remains unknown. Craft activity always drew heavily on palace and temple patronage, though private workshops also flourished. Some artisans worked part-time in institutional workshops, others independently, and both free laborers and slaves were involved. Laws of Hammurabi regulated the wages of workers across trades, while proverbs mocked craftsmen who disgraced their calling. Family ties often kept trades together, and craft quarters named after professions existed in cities from Assyria to Judah. Some industries worked inside cities. Others, such as pottery or metalwork, often operated outside due to noise, fumes, or access to resources. Archaeology shows little of the workshops themselves, since many were simple reed huts that left no trace, though molds, trial pieces, and unfinished objects have been found. Apprenticeships could be long, and later contracts of employment survive from Neo-Babylonian times. Altogether, the crafts of the ancient Near East reveal a world where technical knowledge, artistic expression, and economic necessity blended. From iron smelting and jewelry making to ivory carving and song trading, artisans created objects of practical use and artistic beauty, sustaining economies and shaping cultural traditions that influenced regions far beyond Mesopotamia. Institutions not only provided the resources needed for production, but also offered craftsmen the stability and freedom to experiment with new ideas and techniques. While most skills were passed down orally or through apprenticeships, written manuals did exist on farming, horse training, glass making, cooking, and brewing, and technical vocabularies were carefully recorded. Some of these texts carried strict warnings that only initiates could see them, treating technical knowledge as sacred and restricted. In the Akkadian period, state workshops were organized under senior palace officials, responsible for overseeing large-scale projects such as the decoration of major temples. Precious materials were weighed, distributed to artisans, and carefully checked when returned as finished objects. By the reign of Esarhaddon, state workshops were located in royal arsenals, though when the capital moved to Nineveh, many were converted to storehouses or housing. At Ur during the Ur III period, archives show that many different crafts were supervised by a central authority. Production was closely monitored, with records listing the number of goods produced, the time needed, and the amount of labor used. The textile industry, for instance, was regulated with precise records of grades and work days. Materials were issued from temple storerooms, finished goods were redistributed, and metals were continually recycled in furnaces to produce standardized ingots. The archives detail attendance, recording workers as present, sick, or absent, and rations were distributed in grain, wool, oil, and occasionally other goods. Payment varied depending on rank, skill, and type of work, with foremen or those producing higher quality goods receiving better compensation. Long-term workers, whether free or enslaved, were maintained on monthly rations. In the textile factories of Lagash, thousands of women and children processed wool into cloth, showing the scale of organized production. Workers often served the state in rotation, described as serving their turn, for which they received rations. Outside those terms, they might still be employed and paid wages. These laborers were also mobilized for public works, like repairing dikes or clearing canals. Over time, authority shifted from temples to palaces, most clearly seen in Shulgi's nationalization of temple wealth, followed by Hammurabi's centralization of control under the state, with secular officials overseeing temple accounts. Workshops supplied a wide range of goods, from bags and baskets to furniture, weapons, musical instruments, chariots, and ornate doors, and could pass unfinished objects to other workshops for additional decoration or inlay. Finding skilled artisans was not always easy, and royal officials sometimes searched far afield, even among nomads or deported peoples. In some cases, specialists such as chariot builders were summoned from distant cities. Within the palace, artisans were provided with apprentices, accommodations, clothing, and rations, often serving for life. In international correspondence, the most frequently exchanged experts were not craftsmen, but intellectuals such as physicians and exorcists. Foreign rituals and sacred objects were also valued. One Mitanni king even sent a statue to Egypt to harness its protective powers. Patronage shaped production, as kings and officials involved themselves in details of design and execution. Letters to rulers requested approval of features such as drapery or proportions, and Neo-Assyrian kings personally oversaw the progress of colossal statues. Inscriptions accompanied many major works, and correspondence reveals concern with practical matters like delivery schedules, payments, and strikes. One Neo-Assyrian letter complains that unpaid stonemasons were refusing to work, demanding their wages before continuing the king's projects. Skilled labor could also be moved as part of political control. During the first millennium BCE, deportations included not just soldiers and leaders, but also craftsmen and artisans, whose expertise was valuable to imperial economies. Nebuchadnezzar II, after capturing Jerusalem, carried away nobles, warriors, and skilled workers, leaving behind only the poorest. This practice ensured that the most talented specialists served the state, linking craftsmanship as much to imperial power and control as to artistry or commerce. The people of Mesopotamia created a legacy of ideas and inventions that shaped human culture long before the rise of Greece. Their most important contribution was the invention of writing around 3100 BCE, developed initially to meet the needs of complex accounting. Over time, the system grew from simple pictograms and numbers into a script capable of expressing Sumerian and later Akkadian. This breakthrough influenced other early scripts, from Egyptian hieroglyphs to Proto-Elamite, the Indus script, Hittite hieroglyphs, and even early Chinese writing. Although Sumerian eventually ceased to be spoken, it remained preserved in texts and bilingual word lists, while Akkadian became the international language of diplomacy until it was replaced by Aramaic in the first millennium. Alongside this achievement, Mesopotamia produced the world's earliest epic literature, with myths, hymns, laments, incantations, and historical writing that influenced later traditions, including biblical stories such as the Tower of Babel and the Flood. Their records also included an enormous range of practical documents, contracts, court decisions, sales, marriage agreements, and letters, capturing every aspect of daily and official life. The Babylonians, heirs to Sumerian civilization, preserved and expanded this cultural foundation. They compiled extensive lists of plants, animals, and objects, which later evolved into multilingual glossaries including Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian, and Ugaritic. Though no Aramaic versions have survived, some late lists even carried Greek transcriptions. These word lists, enriched with synonyms and explanations, were the beginnings of lexicography. Mesopotamia also advanced mathematics to a high level by the Old Babylonian period. Their texts include multiplication and division tables, square and cube roots, reciprocals, and even early treatments of algebraic and geometric problems. Practical applications ranged from canal construction to military engineering. While they did not formulate abstract theorems, they applied geometric principles effectively and used the Pythagorean rule more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Astronomy began as simple observation, but by the Seleucid era had reached a highly mathematical form comparable to Greek science. Their calendar innovations, including the intercalation cycle of 7 months in 19 years, laid the foundation for the Metonic cycle that influenced Jewish and Christian calendars. Babylonian eclipse records were later consulted by Greek astronomers such as Ptolemy, and the zodiac and the earliest personal horoscopes appeared in their texts, spreading through later cultures to shape astrology in the West. Technological achievements were just as significant. Mesopotamians developed techniques in glass-making, beer brewing, perfume production, metallurgy, and architecture, and their technical vocabulary was extensive. Surviving recipes describe processes for producing glass, bronze, and other materials, though artisans often guarded their methods. Archaeological finds reveal crucibles, distillation vessels, filtering equipment, and other tools, showing how advanced their craft knowledge was. Many industries had prehistoric roots. Textiles, for example, were already highly developed by the 4th millennium, with bleaching, dyeing, spinning, and weaving well established. Pottery and metallurgy were among the oldest crafts, with the potter's wheel in use before 4000 BCE and metal objects constantly recycled, making early examples rare today. Taken together, these innovations in writing, literature, science, and technology made Mesopotamia a true cradle of civilization, shaping knowledge and culture across the ancient world.